So this is going to be a bit of a complicated video, I think. T, you're here today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the scenario with DC Comics going on and Marvel Comics as well. And this is addressing a concern or a desire I've seen come up that some people have said that they would be totally fine with Marvel absorbing DC Comics in the wake of Dan Didio leaving and Van Sciver's comments on if the 5G event fails for DC, that Warner Brothers would be essentially keeping, like Warner AT&T would keep the movie rights to the DC characters, but that they would want to basically get rid of the publishing house and send those characters elsewhere to have their comics made by someone else where they don't have to foot the bill for it and they just get a licensing fee. Now, we're going to go through a few scenarios of what this could mean. I also do want to throw out there in just a very brief aside, this whole thing, the entire situation with Ethan Van Sciver and his comments, which we will lay out again just in a TLDR, should be taken with a grain of salt. Because as talented as the man has proven to be, he has also gotten a reputation among a lot of comics fans for being alarmist and jumping the gun on concerns he has for comics. So that is worth keeping in mind, along with the fact that this just might all come to pass and be nothing. These are hypothetical scenarios that I have seen people want or seen them want to be addressed that I just wanted to run through real quick with the comics industry and these characters and how they relate to movies and video games and all other products. And just to lay these out really quick, the first scenario would be what some people, who I hate the term fanboy, but I'm just going to say mega Marvel fans, because I think it's nicer, have said that they would like, where it's just Marvel gets everything. Like, let's just say hypothetically they moved the movie characters over. Warner Brothers didn't want money. They just said, screw it, I don't want that. And they gave those to Marvel and they gave them the comics. The second scenario would be what we just laid out, where kind of more what Van Sciver was hinting at, of the comics like moving over to another distributor, which would likely be Marvel, for writing and processing and everything, and keeping the actual movie characters. And then the third one would be the status quo of what we've seen. DC has their characters both in comics and movies, and Marvel has theirs in comics and movies. We're going to just run through those. It took a minute and a half just to lay out the scenarios.
It's a lot of stuff, yeah.
It's complicated. And this starts to dive into things like monopolies. And I never want to talk down at anyone about this stuff, but I really do think that people don't understand how dangerous these things can be in a marketplace, especially with comments like, oh, I'd love it if they just got everything. It's like, in your head, if people are the best possible person they could be, like no one's out for money, it's all about the art, yeah, that could be great. But that's not the real world. We see that every time a comic does poorly and it's canceled. We see that when movies do poorly and they never get a sequel. The people who call the shots are the businessmen, like it or not. We're going to take a look at that first scenario. The idea that Marvel would absorb not only the comics characters, but the movie characters. What do you think about this?
So if they got the movie characters as well,
yep.
that is a comic book monopoly, is what that is. So that's them owning. You're saying that's them owning like Batman, Superman in both comics and in movies. They have all of it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a monopoly.
So do you think that's a bad idea?
I totally think it is. I mean, you're getting to a point then because DC and Marvel are pushing each other a little bit in like the movie realm. Like there's competitiveness. Like Joker making $1 billion, and then there's obviously the Avengers movies that are making ridiculous amounts of money. But there's some competition there between one another as far as just like product quality and the amount of money that they're making.
Yeah.
If you give characters like the Joker and Batman and all of these to Marvel, you're running into a problem where, like, in monopolies, there's a lack of need for production, like as far as to push things out, because there's no one you're competing with.
So the idea then, too, there, just to even simplify that further, is let's say I own Joker, and I own Batman, and I own Spider-Man. I'm not even saying these are the same type of movie, but let's say that Joker and Spider-Man were coming out the same year, and they were from opposing forces. You would be putting more effort, theoretically, into the quality of that movie in order to outshine the other company.
Yes.
Because they're coming out the same year, and even if they're different types of movies, they're both going to be compared as comic book movies. But if they're owned by the same company, I don't really feel like putting Joker out this year. Let's put it out in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do that. Now, I don't think they would, because we've seen Marvel really drive the superhero genre almost into the ground in terms of how often they release. But there is that fact that they could just set the calendar for every release.
Because they don't need to, because they own the character, so no one else is going to put that character out. So
Right.
it's like, well, we've got all of these, hundreds of characters that are potential movies, and we're just going to sit on them and use them whenever we want. There's not a need to bring out the best in all of these characters to compete with another person or another company. So it slows down production. And then as far as just quality too, I don't know if quality then becomes as important as it is. You know,
Yeah.
there's nothing to compete with. So you're not having the problem of, we need to, like you said, outshine our competitor in order to bring people in and generate more revenue. That's not an important factor when you're owning everything. When you have all of it.
Who would even be the competitor? I would argue that Disney owns the by far highest grossing movies on the market whenever they release them.
It's not close.
It doesn't
yeah.
even matter what it is. I mean, they have Star Wars. They have the sci-fi genre cornered, basically. They have all of the MCU. They have their individual things with Pixar. You know, like it's everything.
They have Fox now too.
And that's another thing I think they have Fox now too. And despite how people feel about the Foxmen, as I've heard them referred to, and how their movies have varied in quality, they did do some interesting things that did push Marvel. I mean, Marvel took note of Deadpool and Logan.
Oh, yeah.
They did. Like, they've even straight up said that, yeah, we saw how well Deadpool did, and that character would have to be sort of left that way.
Well, I don't think that it doesn't go without saying that X-Men was one of the very first superhero movies that did really well in the beginning of the 2000s. Yeah. It was a big starting point for the superhero genre back then. So, I mean, that is important to note, too, is that they kind of helped launch this. So they were also a big competitor, and they made a ton of money.
The MCU does sit a little bit on the back of the Raimi Spider-Man trilogy and the Fox X-Men universe, sort of catching traction and them seeing that did well and doing their own thing, and I would say arguably doing it better in some ways and worse in others, but, the MCU's caught on for a reason. And it's just, I don't know, that's a fascinating point. And the point, too, of not even only Marvel having a monopoly then on comics and movies, but Disney.
Oh, yeah.
Because Disney owns Marvel. They own everything. So it's like, it's not just about Marvel Comics. It's also about, do you want Disney to own the entire entertainment industry? And what does that mean for you as a consumer? Because now there is such a thing as things being Disneyfied.
Protecting the brand.
Yeah.
I totally agree. Like, do you think Joker happens if that's underneath Marvel and Disney?
I don't think it happens under Disney unless Disney started making subsidiary companies to release movies under, which they did do in the past with Touchstone, where they released Unbreakable because it was like PG-13 movies that were considered too dark to be under Disney, and this was before owning the MCU brand.
Okay.
So unless you start making these subsidiaries, and Disney is really jumpy about having any adult content linked to them at all. It threatens the actual Disney brand, not just the subsidiary brands.
Right.
So that's kind of what I think too, is if you give them that whole cornerstone of the market, that whole hold, you would not see these adult superhero movies, or at least nearly as much. And frankly, once they started going with Disney, once Disney, started making the MCU, because originally it was not Disney. Remember, originally it was just Marvel.
Yes.
With the first couple Iron Man movies.
Yeah.
Did you notice how certain things did scale back in these movies? I mean, they're high quality, but you don't need this, but sexual content, it's pretty much gone from Marvel. There's very little in it. Compared to Iron Man 1 and 2.
1 and 2 for sure.
Yeah, there was a lot more racy stuff in there of oh man, Tony Stark's banging all these chicks and stuff.
Right.
I mean, they were just kind of doing whatever they wanted creatively. And you do see a difference when Disney comes in and says, "Oh, okay, now guys, all right, let's rein this in a little bit here. Let's rein in the ship." And it has caused more focused stories, but at the cost of some artistic freedom that some people would care about and some wouldn't. And that's just one example. And I do think, though, too, that this is where we want to mention about monopolies, sort of a little brief, tiny history. Rockefellers, the Rockefeller family, owned basically the entire oil industry at one point, for at least the United States. As far as the United States was concerned, they were insane. It hit the point where their company, I believe, in 1911, it was actually broken up into 34 smaller companies because of antitrust laws, which people have argued should be enforced on companies like Amazon and Disney, but aren't anymore. Because under the free market, a totally free market would allow monopolies. But the idea of a somewhat regulated free market, which is what the United States operates as, is like, hey, competition's good for everybody. You should be successful as much as you can. But there does hit a point where if you're just literally slaughtering all competition in your wake and no one can stand a chance, we need to break this up a little bit. You'll still be mega rich. Like, we're not going to take everything from you, but like, the market needs to have a chance to grow or it will stagnate. People will hold on to their money. Let's say you as a monopoly, you now don't have the I would say incentive to compete price-wise. So you triple the price of your products. Maybe that drives a wedge in the economy where people don't want to spend their money in that entire industry. You know, you can crash an industry if you're a monopoly.
Oh, it messes up the entire economy at that point, especially with something like oil. Like,
yeah.
that's a huge
That's
thing
even
back
bigger,
then. Right?
You know, obviously, because as many people as go to movies, everyone drives.
Yes. Yeah.
So
right.
But it's
among other things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still a point that remains. I mean, like, this is something that could really screw up the entertainment industry, and some people argue the Disneyfied entertainment industry already does. Now, despite the fact that Dan Didio was fired, and a lot of comics fans really were not a fan of some of the things he was doing with characters, especially Wally West, he does have a really good quote about Marvel and DC that I think does encapsulate this issue, so put aside any feelings about him and just think about what he said. It's not that we're mortal enemies, it is competition, if you want the truth. It has to be. As we say, the more we compete, the better off you are. It means that we're trying harder to make our books better, so you come to our books rather than Marvel books. That's what the competition is all about. Between the two companies, we still are the industry leaders. There's a lot of companies out there, a lot of great comic books being created, but we really have to lead by example. And so this quote to me really does personify what we're talking about here. The fact that these companies need each other to keep each other in check. They do have less of an incentive to try hard if Marvel were to shut down, or if DC were to shut down, or if they were to just acquire all those characters, because there's nobody to compete with. You can buy their comics, or you can buy none. Because the industry has shown that people are not going to flock to independent books over the big two. And that's a failure of consumers, that's a failure of companies. It's just an all-around failure, but it's what it is. So this sort of moves into our second scenario too, where we actually look at what Van Sciver said, which was, understand it doesn't mean the characters are going to go anywhere. Batman, of course, is a prized possession of AT&T now. AT&T is Batman, and they are going to keep putting out movies and products and toys and all that stuff. So at the very least, Batman.
That's such a weird thing
is
to
their
say.
cash cow.
AT&T is Batman. That's such a weird thing to me, you know.
AT&T is Batman.
That's so weird.
Yeah, you call AT&T and they're like, "Hello, this is the Batcave."
Hello. How are you? What is going on?
So that's the thing here too, is that this sounds like the more likely scenario if Van Sciver is right, and there have been, he is kind of alarmist, in my opinion, in the industry. So there's total chance none of it will come to pass. But let's say hypothetically this does. Now Marvel has licensing for these characters. They are writing these stories and publishing them. Now, what happens with the movies? The movies stay with AT&T and Warner Brothers. How does that affect the comics?
Well, that's the thing. It's the movies are where the real money is, especially if you look at what the numbers for comic books are. So if you're looking at like a normal month, typically, even going back to like 1995 is kind of what we've been looking at on the site called Comic-Con. It just kind of shows you the numbers of what comics and like which ones sold and what the highest.
And you're gonna hear me like clicking around and stuff too.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Because I'm actually pulling up some of those too.
So it's like the highest selling ones down to the lowest of that month during that year. So like normally you'll see the highest numbers are around like 115 to 125,000. That's like the top one, and it usually in the top 5.
This is like in 2000.
Yep.
Which I can show. You have something like Uncanny X-Men is 113,000. X-Men itself is 109,000, almost 110. Wolverine's 87,000. These are doing well, which, by the way, this is the year the original X-Men came out.
Yep. Yeah.
So, I mean, you do see a boost on that. I think this is circular marketing. Mm-hmm. Like, it goes both ways.
And those are honestly relatively low. When you start looking at some of the other ones, like, for example, look at, like, an Infinity War. Or, like in April 2019. So this was
Endgame.
Oh, Endgame. Yep. Oh no. Oh yeah, you're right. You're right. So this is higher. So you look at like Marvel up at the top there. Those are substantially higher than what you would normally get with comic book sales. They're normally around like 115 to 120,000 is what we have typically seen on this website. But if you look at Infinity War,
yeah, the one you were trying to get to,
gigantic difference. And what's weird is DC Comics had the biggest one. But nonetheless, Amazing Spider-Man way up in prices. So you see the movies really complement the comics, which is important
all the time
to know when looking at this.
Well, and people say they don't. Like, people will argue that they don't. And I would argue they didn't used to. Because you saw back in 97. So back in 97, you had Uncanny X-Men at 180,000. X-Men 177,000. Fantastic Four at 155,000. Back then, there weren't really superhero movies coming out.
No, and so, look at how steady that is.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
The first, I believe... Okay, so for this month, April... I believe it's April of 1997. Yeah, it's like the first almost 20 of them... or the first 22 of them are in the 100,000 range. Back then, I would argue that movies didn't matter because there were so few superhero movies and they were so far between that this was where you went for superhero content.
For sure. You
went here and you went to select, very select cartoons. You had things running at the time, like obviously the animated series.
Right.
You had the beginnings of the DCAU. You had some Spider-Man cartoons and some little Marvel dabblings in it. But this is where you went if you're a fan of superheroes.
And it shows in the depth all the way down. I mean, you look at number 19 on this. That's number 1 in quite a few months, all the way up to now even.
Yeah.
You'll see number 1 is around like 115 to 120,000 for the month. And the depth there in 97 is crazy.
When you even start to see this in like May of 2012, where like when Avengers was kind of at its peak running in terms of as a movie, at this point, and the first Avengers, not the first Avenger, to be confused with Captain America. And you had things like Avengers versus X-Men are up here at about 180,000 per.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not 500,000, but you do see bumps from these movies. I think that for people to say that the movies don't affect the comics and the comics don't affect the movies at all is a little wrong. I would say the comics affect the movies less. Like, people are going to go, general audience is going to go see it. There's way more than 178,000 people going to see the movie. So, but the fact remains that you put very little money into making these comics. You probably print them from dimes on the dollar. You have comic book, like people in the comic book industry are historically not paid that well, when they're working for a publishing house versus independently.
Which you have to look at the numbers as to why too. It's just, it's not making that much money.
But that's the thing. So because it's not making that much money, the company then pays them minimum amounts and pockets the rest of it. And so then on months where it's insane, which does happen, the company's making bank on that title. You also have to consider too, like going down the line, even in like 2012, if you look down at like even something from Marvel, like just for example, or something from Marvel like Uncanny X-Men 11, that was just sitting at 70,000. Or you have Secret Avengers at 50,000. I mean, there's a lot of things that just don't make that much, Superboy at 35,000. So it's like, you go down the line and there are a lot of titles that are not bringing in very much, floating on the back of the few that bring in a lot, which are then floating on the back of the movies.
Right.
Nowadays.
Which then brings to the point of like scenario number 2, what it means, I guess, is that it when you look at Marvel, if they just had the comics, it's weird because if DC releases a movie, they're likely to make more money off of the DC's comics. But they're also promoting the competitor at that point as well, because DC is still a competitor in the movie industry at that point. So it then begs the question of, do we continue making really in comparison to our movies, like, Avengers and all of these other movies that are making billions of dollars, is it worth it for us to be promoting our competitor and making these comics and printing them, even if, say, like the new Batman with Robert Pattinson comes out and makes billions of dollars, or $1 billion, say.
Well, let's just say billions for DC's sake.
Keep going. And if it does really, really well, and they have a big boost in comics that at that month, is it worth it for them to make that little bit more money, but also be promoting the Batman brand a little bit?
Well,
so
and why should they?
That's the thing, is why do it? And then it kind of brings up the concern of, well, then DC Comics, where's that going to end up if that happens? You know?
It would make more sense if you were DC and you were licensing out to someone who wanted to do it, to give it to someone like Image or someone like IDW or Dark Horse, where it's like they stand to gain a lot more. They're just a smaller publishing house without movies.
Right.
Like, it would make a lot more sense to give it to them. So that's why, too, this idea of it going to Marvel, to me, doesn't seem plausible anyway. But even if it was, it would not help DC. And I guarantee you it would not help the Marvel Universe.
I was going to say, I don't even know if it really helps Marvel either.
No.
It doesn't seem like a win on either
Try to
way.
jam all this lore into the Marvel Universe, which is already overstuffed with it. And the other, by the way, the other side would happen too if Marvel came into DC. Both these universes are overstuffed with lore. Try to jam all that in. Try to work
new universe
work
in that?
Kryptonians into the MCU. Or into Marvel Comics in general.
Insane.
Hard to do.
Insane.
You know, work Batman in. Where's he been this whole time? What happened?
Yeah.
You have to come up with dumb reasoning for all this stuff, and it just doesn't really work. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's worth either company's money or time. It would almost be more worth it for DC to just say, comic books don't matter, let's just make graphic novels. And we'll release a Batman graphic novel every 4 months. That would be more worth it for them than to do this. And so that just sort of brings us back to our final, not conclusion, but just status quo of the industry and where it's at. Have comic books suffered in a lot of ways since the 90s? Like, they had the bubble pop, you know, in the 90s. Comic book speculators and buyers ran. But compared to now, they still had fairly good sales.
Yeah, looking at the numbers, especially compared to now, it was like we saw on the list, down 1 through 20. Those numbers were at the peak of what we see typically now, even like going from 2017 to now.
When I say that comic books are in a somewhat, I think I said better position, but it feels like more stable position is what I mean. Because you and I are looking at the trend from like the last 10 years. It's not really huge fall-offs. It's more just stagnant.
Yes.
It's like you hold on to the same number of readers. They leave some series. They go to others. They'll read Spider-Man for a while, get pissed off at something that happens there, move over to something else, you know? And like, they don't just quit reading comics. But you're not growing at all. And that's, I think, a big difference, is the comic book industry used to be growing. And now it's not. Now the comic book industry is growing as a movie industry, not as the comic book industry. Those characters have become movie characters, like James Bond. You know, how he transcended a book character into a film character. I would say Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and Spider-Man and Iron Man especially, you know, if we're looking across, like, you know, at both title companies, like, they've transcended books into movies, and it does beg the question, are the books worth keeping around? Because people like you and me love reading them. We do. I mean, like, I'm huge into them, you're casually into them, and we both enjoy them a lot, and the characters and the world, and there's a depth there you don't get in the movies. There's a depth there that you can establish over years of lore that you can't establish in 2-hour films once a year. But they look at general audience. Where is the general audience? People don't want to read. Not even picture books. They want to watch. They want to experience. And so, even as individual companies that are promoting their things to the best of the ability, with DC making their comics, that promoting movies, the movies promoting the comics, and circularly driving sales, and vice versa, is it worth it now?
It's a tough question, and it's just come to a point where there's a lack of depth, the same depth that we saw back 20 years ago. And so it begs the question, like you said, is it worth it for them to keep pushing this stuff out? Instead, maybe focus on it, instead of being like its own separate thing, maybe more of like a supplemental thing to the movie industry. You know what I mean? Where it's still separate.
Where you tie it in?
Yeah, you tie it in, and you still have separate stories that aren't necessarily related to movies, but look at it, I guess don't look at it necessarily as like the comic book industry that's booming. But it's more of like a supplemental thing than by itself, I guess. You know what I mean? And look at it in the way that we're looking at it right now, where it helps to promote the movies, and it helps, which I'm sure they're
and
looking
vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. And so, comic books, I feel like, which it sucks to say, is not necessarily an industry that's just booming by itself anymore. I think it requires brand recognition from the movies in order for people to get into comic book shops now.
I do think that either way, these characters are everlasting. It doesn't matter what medium they move into, even though I love comics. We will always see Batman. We will always see Superman. We will always see Spider-Man. We will always see the Avengers somewhere. Even in 100 years, I think you will be walking around in VR in the Oasis in Ready Player One. You know, seeing Tony Stark hanging out there with all the chicks in his Iron Man suit. These characters have become eternal through the media and through us, and as corny as it sounds, they live on in all of us. And there's so many great comic books out there to experience right now, and the characters will grow. It just depends what medium it's in, and that's scary. Change is scary. So I don't know if it will change or not, but it's scary and it's worth looking at. So hey, by the way, big thank you to you, because you spent a lot of time here you didn't need to, going through this with me, which I appreciate. And thank you to everybody who watched this video. We do hope that you offer your own insight on what you think about the industry, what you think's going on. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more content like this. We are trying to do more comic book stuff as well as video games and movies. And check out the Discord, where you can join in a community of gamers who live in a society like you. We dance downstairs all day long in clown makeup. You know, we're just catcalling the sidewalk outside a Brooklyn neighborhood. And hey, I'll see you in the next one. Follow me on Instagram. I tweet weird things. Wait, that's Twitter. How'd I screw up this outro too?